Did you know that in Victorian London, a full bath was sometimes considered dangerous to your health? Many believed water opened the pores to disease, so instead they relied on a small basin, a sponge, and a careful ritual. Welcome to a quiet moment wrapped in candlelight history. I am Amadeo Francis Hawthorne, your humble guide and storyteller. Tonight we wander together into the forgotten corners of the past. But first, if you don't mind, whisper in the comments where you're listening from and at what hour your candle burns tonight. Introduction: The Basin at Dawn. In the early hours of a Victorian morning, before the streets have fully stirred and before the factory whistles announce the day, a quiet ritual begins inside countless bedrooms across Britain. The fire has burned low. The air is cool, faintly scented with coal smoke that has crept through curtains and settled into fabric overnight. On a small wooden washstand rests a porcelain basin, a simple sponge, and a pitcher of water that was poured the evening before and has long since lost its warmth. There is no tiled bathroom waiting behind a closed door, no polished chrome tap, no cascade of hot water summoned at will. Instead, there is intention. There is the deliberate act of lifting the pitcher, pouring carefully into the basin, dipping the sponge, wringing it just enough, and pressing it gently to the face. This was not indulgence. It was maintenance. It was dignity, practiced quietly. For the Victorians, cleanliness existed in tension with fear. Dirt was associated with disorder, moral weakness, even spiritual decline. Yet water itself, especially hot water, was sometimes treated with suspicion. Between soot and superstition, between industry and anxiety, the sponge bath emerged as a compromise that shaped daily life for millions. Tonight, we step closer to that basin, not to judge it by modern standards, but to understand the world that made it necessary. Prologue: Cleanliness and Caution. The Victorian era is often imagined as unwashed and grimy, a period cloaked in industrial smoke where bathing was rare and comfort was scarce. It is an image repeated so often that it feels almost certain. But when we slow down and examine the record, diaries, etiquette manuals, household guides, advertisements for soap, a different picture begins to appear. Cleanliness was not ignored. It was discussed, it was promoted, and it was moralized. Newspapers carried advertisements promising purity and freshness. Household manuals instructed readers in proper grooming. Personal letters mention washing as routinely as meals. A clean collar, a brushed coat, a washed face, these were signs not merely of hygiene but of character. Yet full immersion bathing was complicated. The dominant medical belief in miasma held that disease traveled through foul air, rising from overcrowded neighborhoods and stagnant water. Many believed that hot baths opened the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to those invisible vapors. To soak too long was to risk weakening oneself. To chill after bathing was to invite illness. And so bathing was measured, limited, often confined to what could be managed with a basin. The sponge bath became a practical solution in a time when plumbing was rare. Water had to be carried and fuel for heating it was costly. It allowed the body to be cleansed without being immersed. It balanced fear with necessity. In this balance between caution and care, Victorian hygiene found its rhythm. Tonight's reading is called Victorian Hygiene and Sponge Baths. Chapter 1: The Myth of the Unwashed Victorian. The notion that Victorians simply did not wash is persistent, but it collapses under scrutiny. Most households, particularly among the middle classes, included a washstand in each bedroom. It was considered essential furniture. Upon it rested a basin and pitcher, often matched porcelain sets decorated with delicate floral patterns. A small bar of soap sat in its dish. A towel hung neatly nearby. Morning washing was expected. Faces were cleaned, hands were scrubbed. Necks and ears were carefully attended to, especially before leaving the house. Underclothing, typically made of linen, was changed regularly when possible, serving as a protective barrier between skin and outer garments. The outer layers might be worn repeatedly, but the linen beneath absorbed sweat and could be laundered more frequently. Soap production expanded rapidly in the 19th century. Carbolic soap, promoted for its disinfecting qualities, became widely known. Scented varieties promised refinement and gentility. Even in modest homes, a small piece of soap represented participation in the broader cultural commitment to cleanliness. Among the working classes, the circumstances were undeniably harsher. Overcrowded lodging, limited water access, and the cost of fuel complicated daily washing. Water might be fetched from a public pump and shared among family members. Heating it required coal that could not always be spared. Privacy was rare in single-room dwellings where multiple people slept and dressed within the same confined space. Yet even here, washing persisted. It might be brisk and partial. It might be done behind a curtain or with one's back turned. It might involve only the most visible areas, face, hands, collar line, but the impulse toward cleanliness remained. In a society where respectability influenced employment and social standing, appearing clean could mean the difference between opportunity and rejection. Industrial cities layered everything with soot. Chimneys expelled smoke continuously. Coal dust settled on window ledges and clung to skin. By evening, even those who began the day freshly washed could feel the residue of the city upon them. The sponge bath, therefore, was not an indulgent ritual but a practical necessity. It was a way of reclaiming the body from the environment. This is perhaps the most revealing truth. The Victorian commitment to cleanliness was not born of comfort, but of resistance. Resistance against pollution, against illness, and against social judgment. The basin and sponge were humble tools, but they represented a daily effort to maintain dignity within conditions that made such dignity difficult. When we look back from our tiled bathrooms and effortless hot showers, it is easy to misunderstand that effort. But for the Victorian household, cleanliness required intention, labor, and caution. It required lifting, pouring, wringing, and wiping, all before the day's true work even began. And so the myth of the unwashed Victorian fades, replaced instead by an image far more human. Individuals standing quietly beside their washstands at dawn, carefully tending to themselves before stepping into a world that was anything but clean. Chapter 2: The Intimate Anatomy of a Sponge Bath. In a Victorian bedroom, the sponge bath was rarely dramatic. There was no splash, no steam curling upward in clouds. Instead, there was the soft sound of water being poured from pitcher to basin, a hollow ceramic note in the quiet of morning. The water might be slightly warmed if there had been time to set a kettle near the fire, but more often it was cool, especially in winter, when breath hung faintly in the air and fingers stiffened before the day had even begun. The person washing would stand beside the washstand or sit carefully on the edge of the bed. Sleeves might be rolled, night clothes loosened just enough for access. Modesty, even when alone, had a kind of internal discipline to it. The body was not displayed, it was attended to. A sponge or cloth would be dipped into the basin and lifted out slowly, squeezed just enough so that water did not spill wastefully onto the floorboards. Water was precious not because it did not exist, but because it had to be carried, heated, and managed. Every drop required effort. The order of washing was practical. The face came first. It was the part most visible to the world and the part most associated with presentation. The cool cloth pressed against cheeks and forehead, wiping away the night's oil and the faint residue of smoke that had settled even indoors. Eyes were carefully cleaned. The back of the neck, often hidden beneath collars, was wiped thoroughly. Hands followed. Fingers were scrubbed individually, nails inspected. Victorian etiquette manuals emphasized clean hands as a sign of refinement. For those who worked outdoors or in factories, this step could take longer. Soot lodged beneath nails and along the creases of knuckles required firm rubbing. The sponge, rougher than modern cloths, sometimes left the skin pink with effort. The upper body would be washed next, though always selectively and with caution against the chill. The cloth was passed over shoulders, beneath arms, across the chest or back as privacy allowed. In cold weather, this part of the ritual might be hurried. The fear of catching a chill was real and persistent. Windows remained closed. Doors were latched. The washing had to be efficient. For women especially, undergarments served as both protection and practicality. Linen chemises absorbed perspiration and could be laundered more often than outer dresses. The sponge bath, therefore, was not always about washing the entire body daily, but about maintaining the areas most vulnerable to odor and discomfort. Clean linen did much of the unseen work. Feet were often washed last. They carried the evidence of the day: dust from streets, damp from uneven pavements, traces of factory floors or muddy paths. In households without carpets, bare boards collected grit easily. Washing the feet required balance, patience, and sometimes a chair for support. The water in the basin, now slightly clouded, had to suffice. It was rarely replaced midway through the process. And here we see something deeply revealing. The sponge bath was economical. It used one basin, one portion of water. It moved methodically from cleanest to dirtiest areas so that the same water could serve multiple purposes. It was less about luxury and more about careful sequencing. In working class homes, where space was tight and several people might share a single room, this ritual required even more adaptation. A sheet might be hung to create a temporary barrier. Children might be washed quickly, one after another, using the same basin. The water cooled rapidly. Complaints were discouraged. Cleanliness was a necessity, not an indulgence. In wealthier homes, servants sometimes assisted. Warm water could be refreshed. Towels were thicker, the process slower. Yet even there, full immersion bathing did not occur daily. The sponge bath remained the consistent everyday standard. Large baths, when taken, were events, prepared in advance, filled laboriously, and often reserved for weekly intervals. Privacy itself shaped the ritual. Bedrooms were considered intimate spaces, and bathing occurred within them rather than in dedicated bathrooms, which were rare until late in the century. The act of washing was intertwined with dressing. It marked the transition from private self to public identity. Unwashed, then layered clothing carefully, linen first, then structured garments, then outerwear that presented a composed appearance to the world. There is something almost ceremonial in this rhythm. The sponge bath was not hurried chaos, nor was it relaxation. It was preparation. It was a quiet claiming of order before stepping into unpredictable streets and workplaces. Water temperature mattered deeply. In winter, the shock of cool water against skin required resolve. Many Victorians believed that brief exposure strengthened the constitution. Others endured it simply because heating more water required more coal, and coal cost money. The body adjusted, the mind accepted. Daily repetition turned discomfort into routine. Even the drying of the skin held significance. Towels were patted rather than vigorously rubbed, preserving warmth. Hair might be brushed carefully afterward, distributing oils. Faces were sometimes dusted lightly with powder, especially among the middle and upper classes, not to conceal dirt, but to absorb shine and maintain composure. And when the basin was emptied, water carried away, sometimes thrown into a yard or out a window in less sanitary districts, the ritual concluded quietly. The washstand returned to stillness. The sponge was rinsed and set aside. The room, once again, appeared orderly. What remains striking is how intimate yet restrained the process was. The body was attended to with discipline rather than indulgence. Cleanliness was achieved through sequence, economy, and repetition. In a world without instant plumbing, without abundant hot water, without modern disinfectants, the sponge bath represented both adaptation and resolve. It was not glamorous, it was not theatrical, but it was constant. And through that constancy, millions maintained a sense of dignity, even as coal smoke drifted through their cities and uncertainty shaped their days. Chapter 3: The Weight of Appearance. Cleanliness in Victorian society was not simply a personal preference. It functioned as social evidence. A person's collar, cuffs, hands, and boots were read almost like documents, quiet indicators of reliability, discipline, and self-respect. Employers noticed, neighbors noticed, even strangers noticed. For clerks and shop assistants, visible cleanliness could determine livelihood. A smudged collar might suggest carelessness. Ink-stained fingers might be forgiven. Soot-darkened nails were less easily overlooked. The body became part of one's public resume, silently communicating worthiness in a society intensely concerned with hierarchy. Among domestic servants, standards were even more exacting. A housemaid's apron had to appear crisp. A footman's gloves had to remain spotless despite constant handling of carriage doors and silver trays. Ironically, those tasked with maintaining the cleanliness of wealthy homes often struggled to secure sufficient warmth or privacy for their own washing. Their labor ensured the illusion of effortlessness upstairs, while their own sponge baths were sometimes conducted hurriedly in attic quarters, and yet pride still existed there. Servants wrote of polishing their boots carefully, of scrubbing their hands before presenting themselves downstairs. Cleanliness was not merely imposed, it was internalized. For factory workers, the challenge was relentless. Coal dust settled into skin pores and hair. Textile mills filled lungs with fibers that clung invisibly. Metal workers carried the scent of oil and heat home with them. A single basin of water had to contend with a full day of industrial residue. The sponge bath was less about comfort and more about erasure, an attempt to remove the visible evidence of labor before returning to family or community. Water would darken quickly, the cloth would turn gray. Still, the ritual continued. This persistence reveals something essential. Victorian hygiene was aspirational. It aimed toward an ideal that circumstances often complicated. To be clean was to align oneself with order in a rapidly changing world. Industrialization had disrupted rhythms of rural life. Cities expanded faster than infrastructure. Amid that uncertainty, washing the face each morning offered a small restoration of control. The basin stood as a quiet counterbalance to chaos. In our next chapter, we will examine the soaps themselves, but first it is worth pausing to consider the air. Victorian cities had a smell. Not one single scent, but layers. Coal smoke from chimneys settled into brick and fabric. Horse manure lined busy roads. Tallow candles gave off a faint grease-laden odor indoors. Open drains, especially before modern sewer reforms, contributed their own persistent undertone. Even clean clothing could not fully escape the atmosphere, and so hygiene was never just about removing visible dirt. It was about managing scent, about navigating a world where odor carried social meaning. To smell neutral or faintly floral was to signal effort. To carry the sharpness of industry into a drawing room was to risk judgment. The sponge bath, then, was sensory as well as practical. It addressed not only grime, but atmosphere itself. Chapter 4: Soap, Scent, and the Chemistry of Clean. Victorian soap was rarely the creamy, balanced formula we know today. Most common household soap was made through a process called saponification, animal fat rendered slowly and combined with lye, an alkaline solution derived from wood ash. When measured carefully, it produced a firm, serviceable bar. When measured poorly, it could sting the skin, leaving it tight and slightly raw after washing. The texture of such soap was dense and matte. It did not glide easily. It required friction. Lather formed slowly, especially in hard water, and rinsing required patience. On delicate skin, particularly in winter, it could leave faint cracks along the knuckles or a whitened dryness across the back of the hands. For those who labored in factories, mines, or kitchens, this harshness was almost unavoidable. Grease from machinery, soot from chimneys, flour from bakeries, oil from metalwork. These clung stubbornly. Strong soap was not optional, it was necessary. By the mid-19th century, commercial soap manufacturing expanded significantly. One of the most influential developments was carbolic soap infused with phenol. Its introduction followed growing awareness of antiseptic principles, especially after surgical reforms later in the century. Though germ theory was not yet universally accepted, the idea that certain substances could purify surfaces began to circulate more widely. Carbolic soap carried a distinctive medicinal odor, sharp, slightly tar-like, almost smoky. It did not attempt to smell pleasant. It smelled clinical. Households adopted it not for luxury but for reassurance. The scent lingered on towels and in basins, becoming associated with safety and modernity. Meanwhile, refined soaps for the middle and upper classes began incorporating vegetable oils, particularly olive oil or almond oil, producing a milder bar. Transparent glycerin soaps emerged toward the latter part of the century, marketed as gentler and more sophisticated. These soaps were often molded into decorative shapes, ovals, floral patterns, embossed crests, transforming an everyday object into something ornamental. Advertisements emphasized purity. Words like hygienic, refined, and complexion safe appeared frequently. Cleanliness had become marketable. Scent played an equally powerful role. Lavender water was widely favored for its calming fragrance and its association with freshness. Rosewater conveyed refinement. Violet and bergamot were also common. These fragrances were not overwhelming. They were subtle overlays intended to suggest that the wearer had taken care. In an era when crowded streets and enclosed public spaces amplified bodily odors, perfume functioned as social diplomacy. A faint floral note signaled that one had bathed, or at least attended carefully to appearance. It softened the harsher realities of urban life. Pomades, hair oils, and scented powders extended this effort. Hair was brushed repeatedly to distribute natural oils and reduce visible dust. Fine starches or rice powders were dusted lightly over the face to absorb shine. Some powders, unfortunately, contained lead carbonate, which produced a pale, matte finish considered fashionable. Others contained arsenic compounds, marketed dangerously as complexion enhancers. The pursuit of cleanliness and beauty occasionally crossed into harm. Skin irritation, toxicity, and long-term damage were risks not fully understood at the time. The desire for purity sometimes outpaced scientific safety. Laundry chemicals also deserve mention. Washing soda, sodium carbonate, was commonly added to boiling water to lift stains. Bluing agents were used to counteract yellowing in linens, giving fabric a brighter appearance. Bleach solutions, often chlorine-based in later decades, were used cautiously but effectively. The weekly wash could be physically exhausting, water heated in large vats, linens stirred with wooden paddles, fabric scrubbed against washboards, hands reddened from immersion. Soap and chemical residue clung to skin long after the task was complete. Cleanliness in this context was labor. What we see then is not a primitive disregard for hygiene, but a society experimenting, sometimes clumsily, with chemistry in pursuit of control. Industrialization brought pollution, but it also brought mass production. Soap became more accessible. Scent became purchasable. Cleanliness shifted from purely domestic craft to commercial enterprise. And still at the center of it all remained the basin, water poured carefully, soap applied sparingly, sponge pressed to skin. The chemistry supported the ritual, but it did not replace it. Chapter 5. From Basin to Bathroom. By the end of the 19th century, something quiet but profound was beginning to shift. The basin still stood in many bedrooms. The sponge still rested beside it, but beneath the surface of daily ritual, infrastructure was changing. Sewers were engineered beneath city streets. Indoor plumbing began to enter newly built middle-class homes. Running water, once unimaginable, became slowly attainable. At first, these bathrooms were rare and aspirational. Porcelain tubs replaced portable hip baths. Taps delivered water without the labor of lifting and pouring. Washing could take place in a dedicated room, no longer confined to the bedside washstand. For those who could afford such installations, cleanliness began to feel less like effort and more like comfort. Medical understanding also evolved. As germ theory gained acceptance, the meaning of soap shifted. Washing was no longer primarily about visible dirt or social respectability. It became a defense against invisible organisms. Public health campaigns encouraged hand washing. Schools taught hygiene as civic duty. The old anxieties about warm water and open pores slowly receded. Bathing, once approached cautiously, became encouraged. More frequent washing was no longer seen as weakening the body, but strengthening it. The basin and sponge did not disappear overnight, but they began to represent an earlier chapter, one shaped by miasma, soot, and careful moderation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the private bathroom was slowly replacing the bedroom washstand in many homes. The ritual of washing remained, but its setting transformed. Water flowed more freely, soap softened, scent became standardized. Cleanliness shifted from endurance to expectation. And yet, if we listen closely, the older ritual has not entirely vanished. It lingers quietly beneath the surface of modern convenience. The instinct to wash before stepping into the world, the impulse to prepare oneself in private before being seen. These gestures remain familiar. Let us step back now, just for a moment, and return to that earlier room. Epilogue, the Basin at Dusk. When we imagine the Victorian era, we often picture fog-filled streets and industrial skylines. But behind those public scenes were small interiors, bedrooms lit softly by early light, washstands near curtained windows, and porcelain basins holding a few inches of water. There, in quiet repetition, millions began their days. First, they lifted pitchers, and then they wrung cloths. They washed not extravagantly, not effortlessly, but deliberately. The sponge bath required participation. It required attention. It demanded awareness of temperature, sequence, modesty, economy. It was not a background convenience. It was a conscious act, one that marked the boundary between sleep and society. In a century shaped by rapid industrial change, washing offered structure. It provided a small, steady ritual before stepping into uncertain streets. It was an assertion of order in a world thick with smoke. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Victorian hygiene. Not merely the plumbing that followed, or the chemistry that improved, but the enduring human instinct to care for the body that carries us forward. Tonight, as the basin grows still and the water cools once more, we leave that quiet bedroom gently. The sponge rests, the towel is folded. The day, long past, settles into memory, and in the hush that remains, we allow the room to grow quiet. Rest now, the water has been poured, and the lantern is dimming.